This is an EWTN Newslink. I'm Teresa Tomeo from Catholic Connection. The Pope did not celebrate Palm Sunday Mass yesterday, but did prepare a homily for the occasion and made an appearance after Mass to wish the faithful a happy Holy Week. In the homily read by Cardinal Leonardo Sandri, the Holy Father focusing on St. Simon of Cyrene and reflecting on how by carrying the cross of Christ we can share in his redemptive love. And President Trump saying he will be outlining the plan for tariffs on imported semiconductors this week. He made the announcement yesterday, adding there will be a certain amount of flexibility for some companies. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick also saying yesterday the semiconductors wouldn't be included in certain tariff exemptions announced Friday for some electronics. For more news with a Catholic perspective, visit EWTNnews.com. I'm Teresa Tomeo, and Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders starts now.
What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic?
Why can't women become priests?
Why do Catholics worship Mary?
What's stopping you?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
Where is purgatory in the Bible?
What's stopping you?
I think the Pope has too much authority.
What's stopping you? You are called to communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome again to Call to Communion here on EWTN. It's the program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. Let me say that again. Non-Catholic listeners, viewers are welcome to call this show if you've got a question about the Catholic faith. That's why we're here. And we've been doing it for a little over 10 years now, and we'd love to hear from you today. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Outside North America, please dial 1 and then 205-271-2985. You can also text the letters EWTN to 58177. Wait for our response, and then once you get that, just send us your first name and your brief question. Message and data rates may apply. Now, if you're watching us on TV today, you can participate as well. Here's our email address for you folks, ctc@ewtn.com. Actually, the email is for everybody, ctc@ewtn.com. Pedro Quiles, our producer. Matt Kabinski is our phone screener. Rich Jesse handling social media for us. If you're watching us today on YouTube or Facebook, we are streaming there right now. Just put your question in the comments box, if you would. I'm Tom Price, along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
I am great. How are you, sir?
I'm doing decent, thank you.
Glad to hear it. Interesting email to lead us off here. This is from Daniel. Am I wrong or sinning if I ask God to do me justice in front of my enemies, knowing that I am also a sinner in need of mercy, and how to harmonize these longings that seem to come from the heart? Thanks, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you. So I think you're in pretty good company. You're clearly in company with the psalmist, for whom this prayer is extraordinarily common.
Yes.
Lord, give me justice in the face of my enemies. Now, I would issue this caution: don't expect it in this life. Right? And, this is part of the value of the general judgment, is that we believe that on the last day that God will call all people to account for what they've done publicly. Now, there are exceptions. So if your sins are forgiven and you've done penance, God puts those as far away from him as the east is from the west, and they're not going to get brought up again. But if there's things you haven't worked out, that's going to come up, right? It's a good motive to go to confession, by the way, right?
Sure.
And you think about the martyrs of the 2nd century who were thrown to the lions for the public entertainment of the Romans who mocked them in their faith. Well, those very same Romans are going to have a rude awakening on the last day, right? God will be vindicated in his saints, and the righteous will be vindicated, and their persecutors will answer for what they've done, right? So this is part of the motive for belief in the second coming and the general judgment. In this life, I'll tell you a story. My father was a practicing attorney for over 50 years. And he had a law partner one time that had a hearing in front of the judge, and the client's with him, and the judge says to the client, "What do you want me to do for you?" The client says, "Your Honor, I want justice." The judge says, "We don't do that here. We give out money." Little insight into the American legal system there for you.
That is so good. Daniel, thanks so much for your email. Here's one now from Sandra. Is there a contradiction between Acts 15 and Corinthians 8?
I assume we're talking about 1 Corinthians 8.
I believe so, yes.
All right. Well, I know Acts 15 concerning food sacrificed to idols. Oh, yeah. Okay. So that's where Paul says that you don't have to worry about food sacrificed to idols. Right? You can eat food that's sacrificed to idols. No, I don't think there's a contradiction theologically. There is a difference juridically. So Acts 15 is dealing with the problem on a wide scale. What should the earliest Christian church do with Gentile converts in order to help them integrate into the largely Jewish church? And Jewish sensibilities were such that it would have been unworkable, right, for Christians to share table fellowship with Jews and eat this kind of food, which Jews are not going to eat. Paul is writing to a Gentile church in Corinth. They don't have to follow any Jewish dietary laws, and theologically, it's a different question. What they're asking about is if we eat food sacrificed to idols, are we in fact complicit in the worship of idols? It's a reasonable question, right? Yeah. And Paul says, no, you're actually not. Just because you buy something in the butcher shop that was offered to a pagan god doesn't mean you're complicit with the worship of the pagan god. However, he says, and this is very consistent with what I think the goal was in Acts 15, if you're eating the meat, say, in a public place, causes your pagan friend to relapse to idolatry. Oh, Tom over here is eating meat that was sacrificed to Zeus. I guess I better go sacrifice to Zeus. Then better not eat. Better not eat. And so different context, different question.
Sure.
If you're hanging out with Jewish Christians and you eat something that they consider unclean or impure or idolatrous, and that causes them to stumble, better not eat. The ultimate criteria here is love of neighbor. Right? Okay. Don't lead your neighbor into sin.
Very good. Sandra, thanks so much for your email. We'll take this one before we go to the phones. This is from Ethan. Do Catholics accept the Septuagint? And we might as well define what that is.
Yeah, sure. So the Septuagint is the name given to the Greek translation of the Old Testament that was produced in Alexandria, and it was the version of the Old Testament in widest use at the time of Christ and at the time of the writing of the New Testament. And so most of the New Testament citations of the Old Testament are actually citations of the Septuagint text. And the earliest Christian book that I know of that lays out specifically a Christian hermeneutic, a theory of biblical interpretation that gets into questions of biblical criticism, is Augustine's 4th century book On Christian Doctrine. And in that book, Augustine raises the specific question, if there is a textual question, should Christians advert to the Hebrew text or the Greek text? And his conclusion is they should advert to the Greek text because it's the ecclesiastical version, meaning it's the one that's most widely used in the churches. Now, if in modern Catholic Bible translations, if you go pull one off the shelf at your bookstore and you open it up, you're going to find a critical text that, and this is, it doesn't correspond to any particular manuscript. What critical texts do is they look at all the ancient manuscripts and they compare them and try to determine what the best reading is. And so what you're getting is a scholar's compilation of what he or she or that committee thinks is probably closest to the original text. That's a different criterion. It's useful for biblical studies, but it's how that plays with church theology is another question.
Ethan, thanks so much for your email. Stay tuned. Lots more straight ahead on Call to Communion on EWTN.
On the next Beacon of Truth, spiritual and moral anchors and more from Psalm 78.
I'm Deacon Harold Burke-Sivers, and I invite you to join me for Beacon of Truth.
This is Life Issues with Brad Mattis, president of Life Issues Institute.
What does a grandmother in front of a UK abortion facility and a free trade agreement have in common? Lots. This British grandmother, a retired medical scientist, has been criminally charged and fined over $25,000 for holding a sign outside an abortion facility that reads, "Here to talk if you want." She's simply offering support and hope. Free speech has been a priority in President Trump's foreign policy, and the president himself apparently stated there won't be free trade without free speech. The U.S. State Department issued a rare statement voicing concern about freedom of expression in the United Kingdom, and it appears British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is scrambling via intense negotiations to keep the trade agreement from cratering. I'll keep you posted.
Follow us on social media at Life Issues Institute.
Praying with the Popes is our free ebook that will help guide you in prayer and find comfort from the words Jesus spoke to Peter. Visit EWTN.com/Chair of St. Peter today for your free ebook.
Helping build strong Catholic families.
This is EWTN Radio.
It's called Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN. Our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Looks like we have 2 lines open right now. You can also send us a text. Text the letters EWTN to 58177. Or if you're watching us on TV today, shoot us an email, ctc@EWTN.com. Good news for all of you who are just finding out about Catholicism or the Catholic Church and EWTN. Here's that good news. We offer the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass from Our Lady of the Angels Chapel right here on the EWTN campus, live every morning on EWTN radio and television at 8 a.m. Eastern. And by the way, we can also send you a link to the Mass each and every day. Visit EWTN.com and click on subscribe. If you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN, beginning today with Ron in Kansas City, Kansas, listening to us on the EWTN app. Hello, Ron. What's on your mind today?
I have a question for you. I've raised Catholic, and I have 2 brothers and 2 sisters, and they don't go to the church anymore, and it makes me sick. And so I've been thinking about this, and I hear some people say, all you have to profess that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and believe in Him, and you're saved. But I wonder, what do they mean by the word believe? But this is my question. This is my question to these folks. Jesus came, and He selected 12 apostles, and He spent 3 years training them. And then He gave them His authority. Okay?
Yeah.
So why did He do that if all you have to do is profess that He is the Son of God? Why did He give them all this authority to forgive sins and all that? You have to ask yourself, why did He select the apostles? Why did He train them? And why did He give them their authority?
Yeah, Ron,
I'm going to hang up.
I appreciate the call. I appreciate the thoughts. I have a few things to say about that. So when you read the Gospels, especially the Synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, one thing that Jesus does not say is that the way to get to heaven is believe in Jesus. He actually doesn't say that. He has a different message. It is quite clear. It's very obvious on page 1. His message is the kingdom of God is here. That means the Jews had this expectation that God was going to come and vindicate the righteous and punish the wicked, and peace would reign and this kind of business.
Uh-huh.
And he says that's happening. It's imminent. If you want to be involved in it, you have to repent. And he is pretty explicit about what repenting looks like. He gives very concrete instructions about things like, don't lust after your neighbor's wife. For that matter, don't leave your wife. Don't divorce her. If you have something against your brother, you better reconcile with him before you go to the altar. Don't pray or fast to be seen by men or give alms. Do these things in secret. Your Father in heaven will reward you in secret. Blessed are the poor in spirit, the meek, the merciful, the peacemakers, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. He gives a lot of very concrete moral instruction. And then a great deal of his teaching, a lot of the parables, a lot of his more sort of evocative confrontations seem to be aimed at unveiling the kinds of behaviors and attitudes that actively keep people from doing that. And so his criticism of the Pharisees, for example, is all wrapped up in a certain form of sort of ritualism or religious hypocrisy or posturing that would make me blind to my own faults be blind to the dignity of the other, whether that person be the tax collector or the prostitute or the Samaritan, drawing attention to those ways in which we neglect and disdain other people, and really sort of bringing home the difficulty of this moral renovation that he calls us to. And then he's very explicit, especially at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, about around chapter 25. He says, "Many people will come to me on the last day and say, 'Lord, Lord,' and I'll say, 'Away from me, I never knew you.'" So he repudiates the easy believism that you also are rejecting, and says the criteria for vindication on the last day will be precisely one's ethical behavior to one's neighbor. Did you feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, clothe the naked, visit the sick and the imprisoned, etc.? So I kind of tend to agree with you. Now, in answer to your question, where do people get this idea? All you have to do is believe. What do they mean by believe? So this is the legacy of the Protestant Reformation, and it was critical. It was essential to Luther's whole approach. This doctrine that he invented, called the doctrine of justification by faith alone. And his view was that, and Calvin's view, and Cranmer and the other major reformers, was that God was angry and wrathful at sin, and that he sort of had a necessity of punishing sin in order to reconcile, and that people were actually incapable of doing these good things. So the kind of life that Jesus lays out in the Gospels is actually unlivable. That's a major thesis of sort of classical Protestantism, the doctrine of total depravity, that no matter how hard we might strive for righteousness or goodness, we can't actually achieve it. And so there's no meriting salvation from God. That's sort of the Protestant idea. So our only hope is if God imputes Christ's righteousness to us, if he counts Jesus' obedience on our behalf, and then through the medium of faith, one believes in the atoning death of Christ, and then Christ's righteousness is imputed to you, and your sins are imputed to him, and Jesus dies on the cross and pays the penalty for your sin, so you can get off scot-free, so to speak. And that's a real critical aspect of the difference between Protestants and Catholics. Now, it raises a number of problems, in my judgment, for the Protestant interpreter, and one of them is the obvious point of contrast to the Gospels themselves. Because this reading of Paul's letters, basically, Paul's teachings on justification that prompt this reflection, do seem to conflict with the straightforward teaching of Jesus in the Gospels that says, many people will say, "Lord, Lord," and I'll say, "Away, never knew you," and the sort of ethical emphasis of Jesus' teaching. Luther felt that tension. He felt it very deeply. And he warned people against the danger of what he called making Christ another Moses, regarding Jesus as if he were just a lawgiver. Well, Jesus is clearly a lawgiver. I mean, like what Luther warns about, I think, is imminent in the text, right? And so he invents a really kind of a very innovative hermeneutical method, a theory of biblical interpretation to handle this problem. Luther believed that you should divide conceptually, not physically, but conceptually divide the Bible into two parts, the commands and warnings on the one hand, which he called law, and promises and forgiveness on the other, that he called grace. And one of the primary functions of quote-unquote law for Luther was not to give you an accurate description of what righteousness looks like as a condition for heaven, but to frighten you at its impossibility, so that confronted with the stark demands of legal righteousness, you would despair of your salvation and then turn and seek God's grace. And so in that way, Luther kind of, he sort of tames the radical message of the Gospels, and for that matter, the Old Testament prophets and the Old Testament law, subordinating it to his understanding of justification by faith alone. So, a lot of Protestants today don't have the whole sophisticated picture of Luther's theology at their fingertips. What they have are some intuitions that they've inherited from the tradition that essentially highlight this idea of faith as when trusting oneself to the mercies of God, and that's all you need for salvation. And they justify it, they warrant it through Luther's reading of Paul's epistles, which I think is basically misguided.
Ron in Kansas City, thanks so much for your call today. That opens up a line for you at 833-288-EWTN. Looks like one line open, 833-288-3986. Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN. Let's go now to John in Tampa, listening on the Ave Maria radio app. Hello, John. What's on your mind today?
Hello, Tom. Hello, Dr. Anders.
Howdy.
The question I have is, what happened to the throngs of people who praised and gave glory to Jesus on his procession into Jerusalem on a donkey, and why are they absent in the gospel account of Jesus' passion What can we learn from this?
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. There's an interesting book that kind of touches on this. It's by a non-Catholic, non-Christian author. It's a Jewish New Testament scholar by the name of Paula Fredrickson. But she has a book where she deals with this question a little bit, and the book is called Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, A Jewish Life and the Emergence of Christianity. And, with the necessary caveats that she's not actually a practicing Christian, is going to bring some presuppositions to bear that a Catholic might not agree with, she nevertheless has some interesting historical reflections on this. And so one thing that we can figure out, I think, and I'm following Fredrickson here, I think she's right, is that Jesus was executed for insurrection, that the Roman charge against him in mockery was that he was the king of the Jews. Why did they come to that judgment? Well, it's because that's what the crowds were acclaiming. When he comes into Jerusalem riding on the donkey, they say, "Hail, Son of David," right? I mean, they recognize him as a messianic pretender. And Rome didn't care that much about inter-Jewish religious squabbles. They cared a lot about people claiming to be king, right? Because only Caesar is king in their judgment. And so we know how to handle this problem. That's easy. We'll just kill him. Get him out of the way. Boom, off he goes, right? And that neutralizes the problem. Okay. Now, your question, like, where are these folks at the crucifixion? Well, hiding, obviously. They're not protesting with signs going, justice for Jesus, and we stand with the Christians. And no, they don't want to be up there on the cross too. Right?
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is that this is another thing that Fredrickson points out, that after the crucifixion, Christians stay in Jerusalem for a generation.
Yeah.
Right. Pretty much until 70 A.D. They don't leave. I mean, there's a thriving Christian community in Jerusalem proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus, and teaching and sending out missionaries and all this. Rome left them alone. Why? Well, they stopped giving the appearance of being insurrectionist. Mm-hmm. It was the triumphal entry into Jerusalem that seems to have prompted the Romans to acquiesce to the death of Jesus.
Fascinating. John, thanks so much for your call from Tampa today. It's Called to Communion here on EWTN. Right back to it. Here is Diane in Tallahassee, a first-time caller listening on the great Guadalupe radio. Hey, Diane, what's on your mind today? Diane in Tallahassee, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Go right ahead.
Well, I wanted to know how the church felt about people who had these, their chromosome was messed up or something, and they passed on a very deadly disease to their children. If they can go and get it fixed, I guess they can go in. Do they marry? Do they do they do birth control, or they just listen to whatever? Tell me what happens.
Sure. Thank you. So if a person has a genetic disorder that they're likely to pass to their children,
mm-hmm.
and they think, that might be a good reason, that might be for me a motive not to have children, the church does not compel people to have kids. And a person could make that judgment and say, I don't think I'm equipped to raise a child that has this condition, or this condition was such a burden to me that I would hate to pass it on to somebody else. And if they choose to remain childless, the church says that's okay. You can choose to do that. How you remain childless, though, is a question of moral relevance, because there are morally appropriate ways to remain childless, and there are morally inappropriate ways to remain childless. So let's talk about some morally appropriate ways to remain childless. Don't get married.
That's one.
Have a Josephite marriage. Marry and don't consummate.
No.
Right? Here are some morally inappropriate ways to deal with that problem. The most common way today is not contraception, it's abortion. And, if you go into the obstetrician's office, they will ask you at some point during your pregnancy, do you want us to perform this procedure where we take a sample of amniotic fluid and we test for chromosomal and genetic abnormality? And I remember when my wife was pregnant with our first child, we had a Jewish obstetrician who understood that we were practicing Christians and knew what our moral values were. And he said, I am required to offer you this test that I recommend you not do. And he said, I take it based on who you are, that you are the kind of people that would never contemplate ending a pregnancy deliberately under any circumstance. We said, we are those kind of people. And he said, in that case, there is no reason for you to perform this test. The only motive for the test is if someone wishes to abort the child before it's born.
Okay.
Right?
All right.
Now, I cannot verify the following statement. I have heard and read, but I don't remember the source, and so I can't cite the source, right? That Down syndrome in the world today is far more common among Catholics than non-Catholics. And I think that for two reasons. One is that Catholics don't abort their children. And there are other families, when they see that there's this chromosomal abnormality, they abort the child. So it's, the rates of acquiring the condition are probably not higher among Catholics, but keeping the baby, the rates are higher among Catholics. Right?
Sure.
The other one is that Catholics continue having children longer if they follow the Church's teaching on contraception. And, the later in life you have children, the higher your rates of chromosomal abnormality. And since Catholics, who practice what the Church teaches, are, may have not just 2 kids and then stop, they may have 3, 4, 5, 6 kids. That 5th or 6th kid may be at a slightly elevated risk, relative to kid number 1. And so you're going to see that reflected in Catholic family life, right? And the Catholic position is that people with chromosomal abnormalities are people.
Yes.
And their lives can be worthy.
Oh, yeah.
And deeply worthy, more worthy than yours and mine, maybe, respect, and maybe in the grand scheme of things, of more value in the eyes of God, even, perhaps, right?
Yeah.
So it's not our judgment to make as to whether a particular human life is worth living or not. That's God's decision, not ours. But if you don't, as a parent, don't think you're up for the job, you could opt out, but only in morally acceptable ways.
Diane, thanks so much for your call today from Tallahassee. In a moment, we'll talk with Andrew in Roanoke, Virginia, Chris in Oklahoma City. Still time for your phone call as well, 833-288-EWTN. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, 833-288-3986, or text the letters EWTN to 58177. Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN.
The EWTN radio listener comment line is open right now for you. If you've got a question or comment about what you hear on EWTN radio, we'd love to hear it. Call 205-795-5773. We'd also like to know how our programming has impacted your life or the life of someone you know. That number again, 205-795-5773. And thank you for listening to EWTN Radio.
Hi, I'm Doug Keck. This is an EWTN bookmark brief, speaking with Michael Pekalik about his book, Be Good Bankers, the Economic Interpretation of Matthew's Gospel, published by Regnery, naturally available through our EWTN Religious Catalog. Tell us, what does being a good banker have to do with the Gospels?
At the time of the Roman Empire, bankers did basically what we did today. Accrue capital, take care of that deposit of faith, for example, if you're a bishop. Think of your money. So usually I'm purchasing, and this is fine, I'm purchasing clothing, purchasing food, I'm purchasing vehicles to move around and so on. But suppose you give to the poor. Are you purchasing something with your money in that case? You are. You're purchasing something much higher. If you give in secret, then your Father in heaven will pay you a reward.
Very interesting. Michael Pekalik, his book, Be Good Bankers, the Economic Interpretation of Matthew's Gospel, with a fresh translation, published by Regnery, again available through our catalog. I'm Doug Keck. This has been a bookmark brief. We shall catch you next time.
By providing quality programming faithful to the teachings of the Catholic Church, EWTN Television is TV that viewers can trust. For a complete schedule of EWTN television programs, visit EWTN.com and click TV.
On the next More to Life, Tax Day.
Feeling taxed by personal and relationship problems? Let us help.
That's on the next More to Life. Now back to Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
Glad you're with us for Call to Communion here on EWTN. If you're watching us on TV today, the way for you to get through to the show is through email, ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. Back to the phones right now, though, at 833-288-EWTN. Here's Andrew in Roanoke, Virginia, watching us today on YouTube. Andrew, what's on your mind today, sir?
Hello, Dr. David Anders. I'm a convert to the Catholic faith, and it was pretty intellectual conversion, and part of that is a comprehensive study of the Church's ecclesiology. And I've noticed a strange phenomenon among certain Catholics of a traditionalist bent, that they can decide if something the magisterium says is in break of tradition, and they can resist it and publicly dissent from this. And this seems to be completely in opposition to everything I've studied. And you read the great ecclesiologists like Bellarmine and Franzelin, completely foreign. Could you help explain that?
Sure, absolutely. Well, the phenomenon that you are identifying, I have as well noted, and it is ironic because many of those same people 20, 30 years ago during the pontificate of John Paul II would have sounded just like you when criticizing theologians on the left that dissented from papal teaching.
Yes.
Right? And now the chickens have come home to roost on the other side of the ideological divide. Yeah. The Church is actually fairly nuanced when it describes the nature of the assent that is necessary for Catholics to papal teaching and magisterial teaching. And it distinguishes different categories of propositions. So at the top of the heap would come dogmas of the faith, like the Trinity or the Incarnation or transubstantiation, to which Catholics are obligated to give the assent of faith, supernatural assent of faith, right? These things are true because God has revealed them. One step down would be propositions that are to be definitively held, that are somehow logically entailed by dogmas, but the Church does not propose them as things themselves immediately divinely revealed. And so the nature of the irrevocable nature of the assent is different, but the basis of that proposition is formulated differently. Sort of moving down to the end of the line would be say prudential interventions of the magisterium about matters of public order, and maybe comments about the political sphere, that kind of thing. This is sort of like the Church's best judgment about how to proceed on a particular issue. And, you might take a really kind of a obscure example that I was thinking about as I was anticipating your call. In 1899, Pope Leo XIII published an encyclical, Testem Benevolentia Nostrae, against the supposed heresy of Americanism that some historians now think probably didn't exist and may actually have had more to do with currents in 19th century France than they did America.
Really?
Yeah, exactly. And the Pope, took a kind of reactionary position that and issues that would, like, I think most people today popes today would not take the same point of view that he had, right? Huh. And another example. If the Pope makes a very specific comment about, say, a political conflict, and sort of weighs in and says, well, I think, Catholics should not support this position, or they should support that person, or whatever. Like, those are prudent judgments about the papacy regarding, a practical matter. And the Pope's prudential interventions are not guaranteed by the charism of infallibility. He can make mistakes. And so what the Church says, what does the Catholic do with those kind of interventions? Well, he offers what's called a religious submission of mind and will. It's not the same thing as the assent of faith, and it doesn't have the same irrevocable quality that, say, holding something that's definitively to be held would take. And so what does a religious submission of mind and will look like? Well, let's bring it right down to grassroots and talk about life in your parish. Let's say that everyone in your parish believes that that we need a new parish hall.
Okay,
the old parish hall is falling apart, and the finance committee has said we've got the money and we need to spend it on this. And then let's say that I don't know, I'm just pulling this out of my head. You've got a school that's had declining enrollment for the last 20 years. A very credible scenario if you know anything about the history of Catholic education,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And it's sort of down to its last gasps. And it's only running because the church subsidy has been propping it up for the last 10 years, and it's just totally unsustainable. And you know, another committee and probably maybe the diocesan education office has said, you know, we think we need to, we're just going to have to close that school, right? And the pastor says, you know what, this is a legacy institution. We've had this school for 75 years, and you know, the people in the community have depended on it, and it'll just look terrible if we close it. So, you know, in spite of what the finance council has said and what the school office has said, I'm gonna spend this money, and we're gonna pump up that school for 2 more years, and parish hall, it'll have to wait. You know, well, and I may not have all the niceties of canon law right exactly how far his jurisdiction extends here, but basically the idea is, he's the pastor. He's the decider.
Sure.
Right? Sure. And so I go, okay, well, you know, at the end of the day, he decided, you know, and that's what it is, you know, and I accept that because he has the authority and I don't, right? And, you know, or, you know, let's say there's a controversial matter of local politics, and again, the pastor weighs in from the pulpit, and you think, well, that was a really silly thing that the pastor said. A religious submission of mind and will means that I'm not going to jump up in the pew on Sunday morning and go, you're wrong.
And here's why.
And here's why. I may think he's wrong, right? But I respect that he has the pulpit, quite literally.
Sure.
And it's his job to be the spokesman for the church and the parish on this particular issue. It doesn't guarantee that his judgment's infallible. So there is a certain amount of leeway that's allowable to the Catholic conscience and judgment in evaluating magisterial, and that includes like all the way down to the level of your parish priest statement. But there's a hierarchy in those kind of propositions that require different levels of assent. And then, you know, in animating all of it is a desire to be in union with the church, not to bring scandal. The Code of Canon Law says that lay Catholics have the right and sometimes the duty to object when the Pope or the bishops or whoever gets out of line. But, and here's the critical thing, it has to be done in a way that essentially respects the hierarchy of the church and should be in accord with the sort of the dignity and office and competency of the one making the complaint. And so, let's say the Pope says something that's crazy. Well, the people who are sort of best placed to point that out would be the cardinals in a private conference with the Pope.
Sure.
Right. Not, for example, like some lay Catholic radio personality who likes shooting his mouth off. Like, that'd be the wrong person to do it. You know what I'm saying? Right?
Exactly.
And all of it, again, should be motivated ultimately by the spirit of unity. And that's what Paul says is the criteria for liturgical propriety. So one of the places I think that some of the traditionalists go wrong, and I hear, you know, all this talk about, say, reverence in the Mass. Well, we think our Mass is more reverent than your Mass, and blah, blah, blah. Well, I don't know what reverence can possibly mean in a Christian context of any value, if the ultimate effect of which is to divide us into sectarian party spirit. I mean, Paul says he singles that out as like the one criterion for liturgical propriety, and that is charity. And when whatever my liturgical ideology is interferes with that, well, then what good is it?
Yeah, exactly. Andrew, thanks so much for your call today from Roanoke. Good to hear from you on EWTN's Call to Communion. Our phone number, we can probably get in 1 or 2 more calls, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Chris is in Oklahoma City, listening on the great Oklahoma Catholic Broadcasting. Hello, Chris. What's on your mind today?
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, go right ahead, Chris.
Great. So, thank you for having me on. Love the show. My question regards the efficacy of the sacraments. So let me kind of explain what I'm thinking here. With some sacraments, like marriage, for example, I understand pretty clearly why that can be good for a person. You're entering into a state of life that's very self-sacrificial. You're going to grow in holiness, and that seems to be the whole point, right? You're going to grow in holiness, conform your life to Christ. That's a good thing. But other sacraments, I don't really quite understand how that's happening, like with baptism, for example. Now, I understand that entry into the Christian way of life can be similar to marriage in that regard, like you're entering into a way of life that can make you holy. But the act of baptism the act of baptism itself, I don't really understand its efficacy, because it's kind of like you're getting wet, right? So I was hoping you could kind of clarify.
Yes. Yes, I'm smiling from ear to ear.
Yes, you are.
I love this question. This is a fantastic question, and it goes to a key distinction that I think many lay Catholics are unaware of, okay? And let me explain that. So, in the Reformation, as you know, there was a big divide over the meaning and interpretation of the sacraments, and Catholics, very much stress the realism of the sacraments. Some Protestants accept the realism of the sacraments. Others tended much more in the direction of just purely symbolic significance to the sacraments. And in North America, with sort of the prominence of evangelicalism, I'd say the sort of symbolic interpretation of the sacraments would be the dominant view among Protestants in North America. In consequence, Catholics are real eager to stress, we don't think the sacraments are symbols. We think it's the real thing. It's the real McCoy, the realism of the sacraments. And they really push back. If you ask a Catholic, hey, is the Eucharist a symbol? Oh my gosh, no. By no means. Get that Protestantism away from me. You're like, that's a very natural sort of Catholic response to that kind of question. Problem is it's not really accurate, because the Church says these sacraments are both and.
Both and.
Yeah, we absolutely affirm the realism, the supernatural efficacy of the sacraments, ex opere operato.
Uh-huh.
But the Church also teaches emphatically that they're symbols. They're both things. They're symbols that convey supernaturally the thing that's being signified. And Catholics who do understand that sometimes will nod the head, okay, it symbolizes, but it's an efficacious symbol, and so the real work is the efficacious part, not the symbol part. Let's just put that in there for show, right? But actually, the symbology is an intrinsic part of their efficacy. I mean, God wouldn't have done it that way if it didn't have a functional purpose in our life, right? St. Thomas Aquinas actually says that the sacraments are efficacious in us according to the mode of their signification. All right. Now, I'm going to unpack that for you, and I'm going to depart a little bit from Thomas. I'm not going to contradict him, but I'm going to add some elements that are not purely Thomistic. Here's how this works. This is how this cashes out. So baptism symbolizes the washing away of sin, death and rebirth with Jesus. That's clearly what's being symbolized, okay? And supernaturally, by grace, it affects those things. But to make them active principles in my life, the Church teaches I must cooperate. So the grace infused into me through the sacrament is fruitless if I don't actively cooperate. But what does active cooperation with the grace of the sacrament look like? This is where Thomas says they function according to the mode of their signification. So I have to consciously appropriate and intend dying to sin, rising again with Jesus. And the sacrament becomes an ongoing symbol in my life of my necessity of doing so. And so as I continually recall my baptism, it becomes an act. I mean, at one point in my life, I don't do this so much anymore, but at one point in my life, I had as my meditation in prayer to take a sacrament and meditate upon the symbol and seek to appropriate it and apply it to the dynamic of my life. And so I would take a different sacrament on a different day, and I would say, okay, baptism, die to sin, rise with Jesus, forgive, right? And I would really try to interiorize that and make it part of my conscious self-reflection. And with marriage, right, it's same message of death to self, but with a foregrounding the idea of self-donation, that I'm giving myself in sacrifice for the good of another, right, as Christ did for the church. Now, to underscore this teaching that the sacraments work according to the mode of their signification, and they don't work magically, right? They don't work automatically in the sense that they automatically affect the ultimate result in me without my cooperation. In the encyclical Casti Connubiis, Pope Pius said that for most people, I mean, this blew my mind when I read it. He said, for most people, the sacrament of marriage is like a treasure buried in the field, unused and unfruitful, because they don't cooperate.
Wow.
Meaning they don't consciously nourish and cultivate the sense of self-donation that is essential to what's being symbolized by the sacrament itself. And so on with all the other sacraments. And so, with penance, for example, what's being symbolized through the act is contrition, renunciation of sin, commitment to reforming one's life, right? Firm purpose of amendment, penance, and penance is both a virtue as well as a sacramental act, right? And what's being shown by the sacramental action is an interior motion that I have to make my own. If I don't, then again, like Pope Pius has said, the sacrament becomes unfruitful in me. Now, here's the biggie, like the big kahuna, right, is the Eucharist. And here, the Council of Trent, especially the Catechism of the Council of Trent, said you have to realize the Eucharist is two things. It's a sacrament and a sacrifice. And the difference between the two is very great. When I read that, it blew my mind. The difference between the two is very great. So Eucharist as sacrifice is different from Eucharist as sacrament. How does it function as a sacrifice? Well, Pope Pius XII tells us in his encyclical on the Eucharist that the double consecration of bread and wine, bread here, wine there, body here, blood there, symbolizes, and he uses that word, he uses the word symbolizes, the separation of Christ's body from his blood. What took place at Calvary 2,000 years ago and is never repeated. It's symbolically represented. It's memorialized, but he only dies once. And that what the believer is to do in the Mass is to interiorize what's being symbolized, namely, as Christ was willing to give up his life and die, right, out of obedience to God and love of neighbor. I must do likewise. And that there is the outward sacrifice of the rite, R-I-T-E, but the Pope says there's also that inward sacrifice of the self. And of the two, and this will just blow your mind, of the two, Pope Pius XII said, it's the interior that is the most efficacious. Right? Yeah. And that's why Second Vatican Council, Sacrosanctum Concilium, says the faithful are to be taught that they offer the Immaculate Victim, not only through the hands of the priest, but along with him, as they offer themselves. And this is the point that I'll never stop making. Catholics are used to saying, the Eucharist, source and summit of our faith. Buddy, it's not what the Council said. Council does not say Eucharist is source and summit. Council says Eucharistic sacrifice is the source and summit. Because if you neglect that interior self-offering, that patterning my life after the death of Jesus, then the sacraments are of no value to you. That's what not participating, not cooperating looks like. Yeah. If I go forward to the sacraments, any sacrament, Eucharist, baptism, marriage, confirmation, you name it, believing that its efficacy in me is simply a matter of the ritualistic performance of the rite, without me interiorly appropriating that and committing my life to what's being symbolized, not just what's being supernaturally communicated, but what's being communicated like cognitively, pedagogically to me. But if I neglect that aspect, then the sacrament is, as Pope Pius XII said, Pius XI, I think he wrote this one, like a treasure buried in the field that's unfruitful, right? And instead what we have is what the Church calls a sacrilegious communion. Or, in the case of sacraments that revive, we have a valid but inefficacious sacrament. So the good thing with marriage, with ordination, with confirmation, is these sacraments can be administered validly but ineffectively. Meaning, you've really done the thing and its work is there, but it won't begin bearing fruit until such point as you appropriate it. So if you receive, say, marriage unworthily, which God forbid could happen, well, you're not really going to have the grace of the sacrament until you start appropriating it worthily.
Sure. Wow, great question, Chris. Thanks so much for checking in from Oklahoma City. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Hey, have you been to EWTN's Podcast Central? It is fantastic. Over 100 great podcasts from programs that we produce here, like this one, and from our partners all over the world. One of those is the Council of Trent. Do you need help answering the tough objections against our faith? Well, in this entertaining and informative podcast, we're talking about Trent Horn of Catholic Answers. He's going to show you how to share your faith, even with those who oppose it, in some very practical ways. You can hear this, the Council of Trent, and other faith-filled podcasts at EWTN's Podcast Central. Visit EWTN.com/radio. Look for the words Podcast Central, click on them, and you are good to go. All right, back to the phones now for Grace, a first-time caller from Wilmington, North Carolina, listening on Wilmington Catholic Radio. Hey, Grace, what's on your mind today?
Oh, hey, Tom. Hey, Dr. Anders. I love your show. I have a question. I'm trying to get at why it is that people say that life is a gift. Because, say, someone goes to hell, it doesn't seem like to that person that their life has been a gift to them. Also, why does God have the authority to punish us when we didn't ask to be born in the first place?
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. Let me say, first of all, Grace, that I'm profoundly sympathetic to the spirit that prompts these questions, that I'm a practicing Christian along with you, and that I bristle at the injustice in the world, and sometimes I get irritated at the fact that nobody asked me if I wanted to be born. And I mean, I've had all these sentiments like anybody else has, right? So I'm going to kind of walk through some of how I deal with that, okay? But I acknowledge that there's an element of mystery in being, in existence, that I can't take away, right? So we're operating in the dark here to a certain extent. So the Catholic understanding of the moral life is that moral theology is a description of the conditions of human flourishing, right? It's just like, medicine describes the conditions of the flourishing of the body. Catholic moral theology says if you want a happy life, not just a pleasurable life, but a worthy life, a life that you could look back on and go, man, that was worth living, right? That you follow these prescriptions, and they're not arbitrary. They're not imposed on us by some arbitrary tyrannical deity from the outside in some way that's extrinsic to our nature. Like if God said, hey, I just mandate that everybody has to really like to play bingo. Like, I hate bingo. That's got nothing to do with me or my nature, right? They're not like that. Okay, they're more like this. Back in the day, I was a teenager, fraternity student in college. Did I ever have a night when I threw back one too many? Yes. Did I wake up the next day with a bad headache? Yes. Did that facilitate, say, studies and relationship? No, right? It clearly didn't accord with my flourishing, And there's this thing called natural law, and we're going to describe to you the conditions of human flourishing. Hey, guess what? If you drink too much, you're going to feel like rot. You're going to screw up your memory. You're going to do bad in class, and you're going to probably mess up some relationships. So guess what? Don't drink too much, right? And the question, where does God get off telling me not to drink too much? It's kind of like asking, where does God get off telling me not to bang my head against a brick wall? Well, go ahead and bang, I guess, if you want to, but you're going to pay the consequences because of the nature that you have.
Yes.
Okay. And so, God's moral authority is not somehow radically disconnected with the conditions of my own flourishing. And so there's an intrinsic rationality to the divine command. Okay. Now, in terms of the finality of the thing and the mystery of the doctrine of hell, I'll be frank with you. I have absolutely no idea how to render the doctrine of hell ultimately justifiable. I don't. I know what theologians have said, and I find their answers unsatisfying. I mean, the sort of standard theological response is to say, well, God's infinite justice, and so the extent of punishment is somehow proportionate to the majesty of the one offended. And so if you've sinned against an infinite good, you deserve an infinite punishment. I don't buy that. That doesn't land with me, although I understand that's the sort of a rationalist response, but it's never satisfied. I mean, it doesn't satisfy many people.
Yeah.
What I can tell you is that when people live in ways that are contrary to their flourishing, in this life, they can experience a living hell. Father Emmerich Vogt says that religion is for people who don't want to go to hell, and spirituality is for people who have already been there.
Ooh.
Right? And that the dogma of hell represents to me what it is in one measure kind of what I already experience in life, which is like the freedom to choose to make myself miserable. Which, guess what? I still sometimes engage in. I indulge in the freedom to make myself miserable. Why do I have that freedom? And why would I have it in a kind of definitive way? Fortunately, I really am being saved by the bell right now, because here comes the music.
Yes, you are. Grace, thanks for your call. Couldn't get to Dominic in Indiana. Please call us back next time. We'll also answer a question from Jack on YouTube and one from Andy as well. Until then, I'm Tom Price. We will see you next time on Call to Communion. God bless.
The most original Catholic content is on EWTN Radio.
If I want to make an awesome meditation, and I think it's
6 tomorrow night, 8 Eastern on EWTN Television and Radio. Live Truth, Live Catholic.
This is EWTN